thank you so much. I'm Benjamin Jones. I'm at the University of Mexico. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about researching the impacts of light pollution. So I'm not going to go into anything very technical. What I'm really doing is I've been working on my dissertation. I'll talk a little bit about that. It's on light pollution and outdoor lighting. But when you do a literature review, you know, in the academy, you get to see what everybody else is doing, and there's a lot of really great work going on. I kind of wanted to share that just briefly, some of the highlights and some of the research that people are doing. And the takeaway here is that, you know, I want to have policy takeaways. So each impact I'm going to talk about, I'll have a little bit of a takeaway from, okay, here's what we know, here's where the gaps are in the literature, and here's what we can do moving forward. Let's see if this does. All right. Okay, so what impacts are we talking about? So I kind of lumped it into three categories based on what's actively going on, what's been going on in the past. So we have the human health aspect. We all know something about that, right? Human health and light. But I'm going to kind of get into more detail on that. What does the literature say on that? What is recent research going on there? Ecological and the natural environment. So this is, you know, impacts of LAN on ecosystem health, biodiversity, predator-prey. Talk a little bit about that and what's going on. And then what I do, I'm in economics, so I'm going to talk somewhat about policy and social behavior. So social research, what social research is going on. And of course, this list isn't exhaustive. I haven't put everything up here, but I think these are the most studied impacts at the moment, and I think this is where a lot of money is going in terms of the impacts on light pollution. So let's go one by one through these. All right, so light pollution and human health. So we need to be careful here. The research distinguishes between indoor LAN and outdoor LAN. That's what we typically might refer to as light pollution. So the indoor LAN research, a lot of this dates back to the 80s and the 90s. And a lot of it was laboratory-based on mice, or on, you know, they would inject them with cancer and expose them to different light night cycles, and then observe melatonin. They would inject melatonin, observe how the mice would react to that. There were some studies done on shift workers, so flight attendants. A lot of work done on that, on nurses in hospitals. We probably all heard about that. And so it was basically at that the conclusion of that research, the indoor LAN research, we're talking about, you know, lights inside, was considered a sort of occupational risk. So it's kind of lumped into this occupational risk category, and then the World Health Organization, which we've all know that they said it's type 2A risk factor for cancers, potential human carcinogen was the language. But they didn't mention light pollution, so they were specifically talking about indoor LAN. So if we would distinguish between the indoor environment and our outdoor environment, this research is really focused on the indoor aspect. And so then the outdoor piece here was kind of more recent. So it's from the 2000s. It's actually going on presently. There's a lot of work going on here. And this is more population-based studies. So a lot of this work is taking either satellite data on light levels and then mapping it, so looking at co-distribution of the light with cancer rates. So some work's been done in Israel on this, and they've actually did a couple of papers some folks did on actually the global distribution of LAN emission with cancer. So it's the effect of the lived environment on health. So the hypothesis here is that light comes in through the bedroom window at night, and that can cause cancer. So this is a different set of research, and this is actually really interesting because from an incidence perspective, from a public health perspective, this is really interesting because this is something that's we control in the sense of policy. We have a lot of policy tools over this with governments. So getting this piece down is really important. All right, so light pollution affects health, but how? So the two hypotheses that are recent, kind of come out of the literature, is the LAN-Melatonin path, which a lot of us have heard of, and then this LAN-Daily Rhythm Disruption. So let's talk about each one of these separately. All right, so the melatonin hypothesis. Most of us have a good idea of what this is. Light reaches the eye retina during the night, reduces nocturnal production of pineal melatonin. And what does melatonin do? Well, it transfers the dark signal to all the body cells. It tells the body, hey, it's dark. And the processes will change in the human body. So there's a lot of work done on this. Richard Stevens, he's at Connecticut, has done quite a bit of work on this. And this is very important. I was actually really surprised. You go through the literature, how much work has been done on this, but just how important melatonin conversion is to the human body. And it's fairly conclusive, I would say, in the literature that the blue shortwave illumination, less than 500 nanometers, is most effective at suppression. So study after study has demonstrated this. And less melatonin may result in estrogen receptor affinity. So really kind of here, so the breast cancer link that we typically hear about, this is coming out of work that has been done showing that we don't really understand what causes breast. We know it's estrogen, buildup of estrogen in the body over lifetime. But what are the factors that cause that? And I think Stevens actually has a quote here, if I read it. In 2009, in one of his papers, he does a lot of work on breast cancer and melatonin. He said, for breast cancer, there is no consensus on the major causes, and it thus remains a mystery. And explain that through melatonin and through LAN, that's kind of how that opening has resulted, is, okay, we don't understand it, so LAN might play this large role, but why and how? And so that's where a lot of the research is going in, and to find those causal mechanistic links between LAN exposure and breast cancer. So some subtle points, I guess, that we may not know of is the dose-response relationship is not known. So how much light do you need before you start getting, what level of melatonin changes, so reductions in melatonin. That has not been worked out. That's a very active area of research. Is it 10 lux? Is it 20 lux? What's the duration of the exposure you need? We know it's a certain wavelength, but not much else. The role of mitigation, so it's quite a bit of work going on there. If it is coming into the bedroom environment, how do curtains play a role there? So curtains, or what they call the eyelid effect, so not closing the eyes at night. How much of that is going on and could be mitigating a lot of this? So there's this nice little, in a book here about human health and light. You can't actually read it that well here. It's too bad. But it actually divides up a high-risk group. So we think nighttime workers in high LAN environments are high risk. So this is actually the number of dark hours, 24 hours, and the number of light hours. And then we have the low-risk group. So people who are blind, people who sleep a lot are much more low risk. Okay, and then the daily rhythm disruption hypothesis. This is this idea of the circadian rhythm, idea as regulation of the body. This is a separate sort of hypothesis from the melatonin. This is the idea that you're actually active at night. So it's independent of exposure to light. It's just the idea that the body has a natural regulation. So you could be up all night long with no light exposure whatsoever, and you would still have disruption. It's related to the melatonin hypothesis because you have circadian disruption by being active at night, you have melatonin suppression because of LAN exposure, but then you have both, right? So most of us are active at night with LAN exposure, unless you're an astronomer, maybe you don't have any at all. But that's a really active area of research, understanding how being active at night and LAN exposure, how they work together to affect human health. So just concluding this one piece here, this is a great book that just came out this year. I actually have a copy of it. It actually goes through and talks about all the recent research on human breast and prostate cancer. We do know that the association between indoor LAN and cancer is strongest. It's not clear that outdoor LAN, so light coming in through the bedroom window, is causing cancer. That's a very active area of research. The hard evidence is lacking at this point. People are wondering, is LAN sufficiently bright? Is there enough light coming in the bedroom window to affect our health? Now, there's probably enough indoor LAN that it does, but from a policy perspective, we really want to piece down is light pollution or is outdoor LAN doing that? And so then the takeaway point here, exposure to bright indoor LAN, so kind of what the literature suggests is greater than 30 lux. There was actually a paper just came out about a month ago by Mark Ria at Rensselaer Polytechnic. Greater than 30 lux is perhaps a threshold between 2 and 4 a.m. over long duration, so at least 30 minutes, is likely harmful to health. So in the sense that it reduces melatonin production significantly. But the research isn't clear that light pollution per se harms health for most of the general population. That needs to be worked out more. That's kind of some of the research that I'm working on. Okay, so then the second piece, ecological consequences. So picture here, just we've seen a lot of these, right? Moths swarming around a stadium. So outdoor lights act as little suns for living creatures. And natural departures from the light-day cycle evoke huge physiological and behavioral changes. And I think this is especially important in the WUI, or the wildland-urban interface, the border between, our urban environments and, pristine natural environments. So that border, so I live in Albuquerque, so we have mountains on the east side of town. So lights along those areas are going to have much more ecological impacts because there's transition there of ecosystems. And the land alters natural reproduction cycles. There's been a lot of work on this, and a lot of work showing how the predator-prey relationship is changed, resulting in new equilibria. So measuring what those new equilibria are. So we have all these moths around this light. So the bats have learned to feed around here, or the owls have learned to feed, or different nocturnal creatures learn to feed around these areas. It's altering those equilibria, which is really critical to understand how that's going on. Let's see. A lot of work been done on land stressing the bodies of animals, causing them to eat too much or not enough, losing body weight, becoming stressed, dying prematurely, sleep deprivation. It's also hypothesized, there's some work that's been done showing that melatonin in animals is actually affected as well, just as it is in humans. And melatonin serves different purposes in different species than it does in humans. Not so much research-based. I was actually going through this book, and I found this nice quote. I just kind of wanted to share it. It says, "We are, for the most part, diurnal, visual. As we consider the transformation of the planet, mostly we envision changes that we are able to see day by day. It is an inherent bias in our collective thinking, but as we light up the night with ever more powerful lights, is it not obvious, giving the matter some thought, that we are wreaking havoc on creatures with physiologies far more delicate than ours, interfering with the life ways of suites of organisms that have evolved over the millennia with a dependable pattern of light and dark. All this happens at times when most of us are sleeping. As the night is ever more brightly lit, at least we can close the shutters. But what of the plants, or the animals in the plants?" So that's kind of a motivation, I think, for a lot of these ecological. This comes out of this book here that was edited by Catherine Rich and Travis Longcourt. I think he's still at UCLA. Ecological Consequences of Artificial Night Lighting. So where does that leave us? Okay, so land drastically alters the natural environment. Short blue-white light is associated with more extreme impacts. So that's true for humans, and it's true for animals as well. And I think outdoor lights along the WUI might be the most harmful because that's that transition zone, and there's not a lot of research that's been done in this area. At least that's not that's been published. But what's I think is really important here is this dose-response relationship. Once again, as with a lot of this work, we know there's an effect, but what is that effect? What's the causal mechanisms? How much light is needed before you get an effect? And what kinds of durations of exposure do you need? And that really hasn't been worked out very well. And that's kind of where the research is going. And so I guess takeaway from this piece is that long wavelength lights with shielding to minimize exposure to sensitive areas is recommended. I think that's a lot of the work that the national park guys have been doing. I think that's great because the sensitive areas, which are national parks, putting lights up in those areas is going to have much more extreme impacts than just adding another light to a city, perhaps. I think more thought should be put into whether the light is truly required. So I'm an economist, so benefit cost analysis. We should think more, do we really need these lights in the operational cycle, as others have mentioned. Okay, and the final piece here is my area of research, so social science research. So this is a very broad field. There's a lot of people all over the world doing this sort of, doing social science work. Some great conferences just took place over in Europe, in October, I think, last month, and there was one over the summer. Some of the projects, we're talking about social science, so we're interested in what do people think about this? So Nancy did you're doing some great work with that, about public perceptions and that's really interesting to us because it's not clear what people think about lights, what people think about light at night and the exposures they have, the trade-offs that people are willing to make. So we know that there's crime and safety benefits that lights provide, but then when you present people with, well, there's this cost as well. There's cost on the environment, there's cost on health. How are they willing to make these trade-offs? And there's hardly any literature on that. So a couple of the projects, there's been some work done on per capita GDP in light pollution. So looking at so as we observe countries growing over time, how does the amount of light pollution change? And there's actually been some thresholds found for that. So I think around $20,000 US dollars per capita GDP. There's actually between like there and I think about $30,000. There's actually a dip in the amount of light pollution, and then it peaks back up afterwards. So that's interesting. And then per capita GDP and land-related cancer. So there's some quite a bit of work looking at economic development, and more developed countries have higher rates of cancer. And if we control for electrification, which might be a proxy for LAN, as these two gentlemen did actually this year, we find that we can explain quite a bit of the dispersion in cancer rates by electrification and GDP levels, which is really interesting because it's suggestive at the population level that LAN is co-distributed with cancer rates. And GDP is playing a role there because it's increasing the amount of land. So some of the work that I'm doing, willingness to pay for a darker night sky. So we do a lot of work in economics about how much people are willing to pay for improvements. Some work done in Japan, and then in national parks, Mitchell and some other guys went to several national parks back, I think it was before 2008, asking people how much they'd be willing to pay to improve street lights back in the urban areas. I'm actually doing this in Albuquerque. I'm actually doing focus groups. I have one of them pictured here. We just did this. We did one last week, and we did one actually on Wednesday at the university. We're bringing people in and asking them about the benefits and the cost of streetlights and what they think about them, the trade-offs that they're willing to make, and are they willing to pay something maybe on their electricity bill, so maybe $1 a month in addition, with the proceeds being used to further dark sky education or improvements to streetlights, but from a holistic approach. So crime and security improvements as well as mitigation of environmental and human health. So it's really interesting to get people's opinions on that. And then the benefit cost analyses of streetlight improvements that was done in the UK. So kind of mentioned a little bit of what I'm working on, but I think geospatial mapping is really important at this stage. Using software like ArcGIS, taking light, so I actually have data on all the streetlights in Albuquerque, taking all those, putting them into a computer software, and then looking at, okay, if I do a survey of people who live in Albuquerque, your house is here, you have a streetlight right next to you. How does that impact your opinion on light pollution? How does that impact your opinion on crime and safety? Do you see the streetlight as improving your crime and your safety? And then I know, reducing crime and improving your safety. And I know the attributes of that streetlight, so then I can start developing an econometric model showing which type of lights are co-distributed with what sort of preferences. And that's really, I think that's moving forward here with the tools we have at our disposal now to do these sorts of analyses. And then I think mapping lighting presence to health indicators. And as I was talking to Dan just a little bit about this, the break, that there's actually been a lot of work done on satellite data saying, okay, so we have satellite land data, and we know that there's some relationship between brighter areas and cancer, but how do we map that with actual streetlights? So how do we take satellite data, streetlights themselves, and then health indicators? So stress, cancer, and obesity. So that's trying to get at that light coming in the bedroom question, and whether that's really how that's affecting our health. And so I think that's all really great stuff that continue to work on. So I'm running out of time, so just some final thoughts. I think it's a really exciting time to be in this research. We've really identified that light pollution impacts our world, we know that, but the causal mechanisms aren't clear. And that's where the research is going, is explaining how and in what ways LAN is altering our world. We do know that blue-rich white light is associated with more extreme impacts. Some individual solutions to the health risk. Sleep in a dark room, minimize exposure to any light after midnight, but particularly between 2 and 4 a.m. Use curtains and blinds as necessary. policy implications, which I think are very critical. I think there's a lot of emphasis on dark skies. The focus groups I've been doing suggest people don't really care so much about the stars in the skies in particular. They're more interested in the safety, security, and the environmental impacts. And so I think a holistic approach is really needed. And I think if we do this, an urban design holistic approach, that the support for outdoor lighting improvements is much easier to get. So you can ask me questions later. Thank you so much for your time.